Gray light sifted through the narrow windows of Ironwood State Prison, a muted glow, as though even the sun had hesitated to cast its warmth on the grim happenings inside. Guards marched the hallways in a predictable pattern, their boots striking the concrete with rhythmic precision. The walls around them, a dull, institutional blue, only seemed to amplify the stillness. In one of the secure wings, Leonard Len Jackson was shackled to a steel bed, a lone figure in a world that felt like it was closing in on him. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across his face. A single bulb highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion that had etched themselves there. He hadn't slept well for the past week, not since the final order had been given. Tomorrow would be the day. At sunrise, he'd be moved to the last cell, the sterile one, right next to the execution room. 2 hours later, they would carry out the execution. He had no visitors, no family, only the occasional visit from Reverend Morris, the prison chaplain, who had been one of the few sources of comfort in the past weeks. Len's final wish hadn't wavered. "I want to see Eclipse before I go," he'd asked the guard outside his cell for what felt like the 100th time. Eclipse was the German Shepherd he'd adopted 3 years before his arrest, and the bond they had shared was deeper than any Len could explain. That dog had been his companion, his solace, in a life that had turned upside down. Mara Batista, the warden, appeared at the door of his cell. Her posture was stiff, professional, but there was a softness in her eyes that hinted at something more. She had no illusions about the man she was dealing with, but there was a certain respect, even if it was begrudging. "Jackson," she began, her voice measured, "final requests are subject to approval. You understand that, right? Bringing an animal onto prison grounds isn't standard practice. And as of now, we have no idea where this dog is." Len's voice came out hoarse and rough, still weak from the long silence. "Wing, I know where he is," he cut in, a glimmer of desperation creeping into his tone. "Eclipse has been with Helen Griggs, my fiancée. She still has him. She hasn't let him go." He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. He could feel the weight of his own throat closing up, but he pushed on. "Please, Warden, if you could just let me see him. It's the one thing I'm asking for." Warden Batista studied him for a moment, her eyes betraying just the slightest hint of sympathy, though she quickly masked it behind the usual formalities. "I'll see what I can do," she said, her voice softening imperceptibly. "But don't get your hopes up." She turned to leave, but Len couldn't help but feel the tiniest spark of hope ignite in his chest. As the warden walked away, Len's thoughts spiraled. He had spent 5 long years shouting his innocence to anyone who would listen. But the walls of Ironwood State Prison had a way of swallowing your voice, making it seem like even the truth was a whisper against the roar of condemnation. Reverend Morris had believed him to an extent, but the world around him, the courts, the public, the people who had once known him, had closed their ears to his cries. No one believed him, and time was running out. But the only person who still clung to the possibility of his innocence was Helen. Yet even she had been powerless. All she could do was watch. As the clock ticked down to his final moments, Len closed his eyes, sinking back onto the cold steel bed. He could hear the murmurs of guards just outside his cell, a conversation drifting in from the hallway. "Half of them think he's guilty," one of the guards said. "The other half wants the death penalty abolished entirely." The words didn't matter. It wouldn't change anything. In a few hours, the needle would end it all. He pushed himself up from the bunk and walked toward the small window in his cell. It was a narrow slit, high above the ground, just wide enough to catch a sliver of the sky. It wasn't much, but it was something. A pale, pinkish light was spreading across the horizon, the first hint of dawn. For it, the soft glow of the morning sun reminded him of the days he used to walk eclipse through the streets of Redwood City. Those were the moments he had cherished before. It all fell apart. He could almost see the dog running circles around him, his tail wagging excitedly, his ears perked up, eager for the day ahead. It was a time of innocence, a time before the weight of prison bars closed around him. For a moment, he could almost feel Eclipse tugging at the leash, hear the familiar sound of the dog's paws pattering against the pavement. The sound of a guard's knock brought him back to the present. "Jack, time to go," the guard called through the bars. "They're moving you to the final holding cell. Warden wants you prepped." Len's heart sank. Was this it? Was he about to get his last wish? His throat felt tight. The words caught somewhere between his chest and his mouth. "Am I going to see Eclipse?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The guard hesitated for a second. "I don't know. They're checking with the Department of Corrections. Don't get your hopes up." With a resigned nod, Len turned around, offering his wrists for the cuffs. He had grown so accustomed to the cold, metallic click of shackles over the years that it barely fazed him anymore. There was no fight left in him. He had given up on fighting. After all these years, it didn't matter anymore. As the guard led him down the hallway, Len glanced back one last time at the window. The band of morning light seemed to flicker in the distance, almost as though the sun was waiting for something, waiting for him, maybe, to see the world one last time. He didn't know if he'd ever feel that warmth again. But the fleeting thought lingered, a final, faint wish. Helen Griggs sat in her truck, parked just outside the small townhouse she had rented. After everything changed, it was just past owling a.m., and she hadn't slept. A wink. Her mind had been racing ever since she saw the news report. Leonard Jackson's execution was scheduled for that morning, and she felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her chest. Inside, Eclipse, the German shepherd that had once been the centerpiece of her life with Len, lay curled up on a dog bed. Tick, his fur, a little more worn than before, seemed to tell the story of the years that had passed without Len by his side. But when Helen's footsteps echoed through the hallway, Eclipse's snapped up, his ears perked, and his eyes, bright and full of life, locked onto her with a look of recognition. Helen's heart clenched as she caught sight of the dog's gaze. Eclipse hadn't seen Len since the trial, 5 long years ago. She crouched down, gently stroking the dog's head, her fingers trembling slightly. "You miss him, don't you?" she whispered softly. "I know you do." Despite everything, Helen had never wavered in her belief that Len was innocent. From the moment he'd been arrested, she knew something wasn't right. The evidence against him had always been questionable. A partial fingerprint on a murder weapon, vague eyewitness statements, and a financial motive that never quite made sense. The prosecution had done its job well, delivering a case that seemed airtight to the jury, but Helen had never accepted it. She spent years fighting for Len, contacting journalists, appealing to anyone who would listen, but every effort felt like it was in vain. There were days when she thought she might never get him back. And now, with just hours left before the execution, she had to fight harder than ever. Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, heart racing, to see a call from Ironwood Prison. She answered it quickly. "Hello? A calm official voice came through. "Miss Griggs, this is Warden Batista. I'm calling regarding Leonard Jackson's final request." Helen's breath hitched. "Is there any change? The governor might—" "I'm sorry," Batista interrupted. "There are no stays interrupted. There are no stays or delays. The execution will proceed as planned. However, Mr. Jackson has requested to see his dog, Eclipse, one last time. He says you have him." Helen's stomach dropped. "He still wants to see Eclipse?" "Yes," Batista said. "We've never done anything like this before, but I received conditional approval from the Department of Corrections. We're short on time, though. You and the dog need to be here within Joster's minutes, or it won't happen." Helen's heart raced as she looked down at Eclipse. The dog, sensing her distress, let out a soft whine, his eyes full of concern. She forced a smile, though it was fragile and barely there. "I'll bring him. We're leaving in 5 minutes." She hung up, the finality of the words echoing in her mind. She looked at Eclipse, who stood up, tail wagging, though his eyes betrayed the same nervous energy she felt inside. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's go see Len." In the midst of her fear and uncertainty, she gathered her courage. She grabbed Eclipse's leash, quickly throwing on her coat and heading out the door. She had to make it in time. She had to fulfill Len's final wish. The drive to Ironwood Prison was a blur. Helen pushed the truck to its limits, speeding along the empty roads as the first light of day slowly crept across the sky. The pink and orange hues of the morning seemed to mock her, reminding her of how different everything had been just 5 years ago. Back then, everything had felt full of promise. They had been happy, hopeful about their future together. Now, that future was slipping through her fingers. She glanced back at Eclipse in the rearview mirror. The dog had his head pressed against the window, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Every so often, he let out a soft whine, as if he knew the gravity of the situation. Helen couldn't help but feel the weight of it, too. What if they were too late? What if something went wrong at the last minute? Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting to the prison. Her mind raced as she imagined what would happen if they were denied entry. She couldn't let that happen. Ironwood Prison's towering fences and barbed wire loomed ahead, casting an imposing shadow over the road. As she pulled up to the gates, her pulse quickened. The 2 sets of gates opened slowly, controlled by guards in a small booth. Palo Fetter, the reality of what she was about to do, hit her all at once. She pulled up to the side entrance, as directed, and parked. "Wait here," the officer said, glancing at the dog in the back. "We need to confirm everything inside." Helen nodded, her hands shaking as she reached back to give Eclipse a reassuring pat. "Just a little longer, boy. You'll see Len soon," she murmured, even though she wasn't sure she believed the words herself. Eclipse pressed his muzzle into her hand, his soft, comforting presence helping to calm her, if only slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining what it would be like to see Len again. Would he still look the same? Would he remember her? Remember. So many questions filled her mind, but for now, she had to wait. Finally, the door to the administrative wing opened, and a different guard emerged. He nodded toward her. "You can come in now." This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had hoped for, even if it had come too late. Anton Delacroix adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a man who felt like he was on the edge of a life-altering decision. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, his sharp hazel eyes betraying a lifetime of secrets. he had kept buried for far too long. After 3 decades as a detective, he was preparing to retire. But the weight of one unresolved case had been gnawing at him for years. Leonard Jackson's conviction. Anton had been the lead detective on the case that had put Len on death row. The evidence had seemed solid at the time. Partial fingerprints on the murder weapon, questionable eyewitness statements, and a financial motive that tied Len to the victim. Raymond Kincaid, a local businessman with powerful connections, had been found dead, and Len had been the one who got caught in the crosshairs. But lately, something didn't sit right with Anton. His old partner had confided in him about some discrepancies in the case, how certain testimonies seemed coerced, how the victim's history had mysteriously disappeared from the records, and how certain digital traces had been conveniently ignored. The partner had openly doubted the case's integrity, but Anton had remained silent, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The closer the execution date got, the more the case haunted him. He revisited the transcripts, the video footage, and the case files. Every time he looked at the evidence again, details jumped out at him that he had missed before. The timeline of events didn't add up. Portable, sit event. Kincaid had enemies, powerful ones, who had far more reason to want him dead than Len ever did. And the so-called hush money found in Len's bank account? It had never been traced to a clear source. It could have been anything. Anton's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from a friend still working in the district attorney's office. Jackson's final appeal was denied. Execution set for Joling a.m. If there's anything left to do, do it now. The text hit him like a punch in the gut. It was too late. Or was it? Anton had thought about stepping forward before. He had considered coming clean, admitting that he wasn't sure they had the right man. But he had hesitated. He had allowed the pressure of the case and his career to cloud his judgment. Now, as Len's execution loomed closer, Anton couldn't sit by and let an innocent man die. His hands were shaking as he dialed a number into a burner phone. It was a contact he had made a few years ago, someone who specialized in retrieving hidden digital footprints, someone who could dig up new evidence if it existed. "Yeah?" came the voice on the other end. It was low and gruff. "It's Delacroix. I need your help. There's a chance Jackson wasn't guilty. I need you to pull everything you can from Kincaid's financials, from phone records, anything that points away from Jackson and toward someone else." A long pause followed. Then the voice responded, "You got it. We're running out of time. I'll do what I can. But don't expect miracles." Anton hung up, his heart pounding. He slid a gun into a leather holster beneath his jacket. Not that he expected trouble, but old habits died hard. His mind was racing as he headed out the door. Thoughts consumed with one question: what if we got this wrong? As he drove through the city, memories from the investigation flooded his mind. The interrogation of Len, the calm, almost bewildered way he had denied any involvement in Kincaid's murder. "I didn't do this," Len had insisted, his voice steady and his gaze clear. Anton had interrogated countless criminals over the years, and Len's demeanor had never fit the typical profile. Len hadn't seemed like a killer, but he had been convicted nonetheless. Anton pulled into the parking lot of a public library. The building was closed, but the Wi-Fi reached the parking lot, and that's all he needed. He pulled out the flash drive with the case files, popped it into his laptop, and began uploading everything he had on the case. His contact would be working on it as fast as possible. But There was no guarantee they would find anything in time. While he waited, Anton thought about the Jackson case. It never added up. The lack of a clear motive, the circumstantial evidence. How had they all missed the bigger picture? How had he missed it? And if Lynn wasn't guilty, if he had been wrongfully convicted, what would that mean for Anton's career? Could he live with that? His phone buzzed again. The message from his contact came through. Received. Give me an hour. Anton quickly typed back. We don't have an hour. Execution is at Joe Hurry. He started the car and headed toward the county courthouse. He knew it was a slim chance, but he had to try. If there was any evidence that could exonerate Lynn, Anton had to be the one to find it. He wasn't sure what he would do if the evidence came through, but he had to at least try to give Lynn a fighting chance. The city skyline appeared in the distance, the sun beginning to rise behind the glass and steel buildings. Anton's mind raced. What if they couldn't find anything? What if the system was too broken to be fixed? But he couldn't stop now. He had to try. He reached the courthouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he parked. In the lot, the clock on the dash read TR's AM. They had just under 2 hours to stop the execution. Anton pushed open the door, determined to do whatever it took to bring the truth to light. Len Jackson was led down a series of narrow, sterile hallways, the walls lined with harsh fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, casting an eerie glow. The sound of his chains dragging against the concrete floor echoed with each step he took. He'd then a howl, amplifying the hollow emptiness around him. His heart was pounding in his chest, the noise of his footsteps drowned by the rhythmic clinking of his shackles. Each step brought him closer to the final holding cell, a place that had been prepared for him in the execution wing. The cell was stark and devoid of comfort, white-tiled walls, an uncomfortable metal bed, and a single flickering light above. Nothing that would offer any solace. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, a reminder of the place's purpose. This was it, the final step. There would be no coming back from this. No more appeals, no more chances. The door to the cell creaked open, and a female correctional officer, Officer Garcia, stepped inside. Her expression was impassive, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed her discomfort. She removed Len's handcuffs through the door slot, offering him a brief moment of relief as the cold metal no longer bit into his skin. "You've got about 30 minutes, Garcia said, her voice soft but strained. "They'll prep you soon. If the warden says yes, you'll see your dog." Her words hit him like a shot of adrenaline. He tried to keep his composure, but his chest tightened with anticipation. The last thing he had asked for, his final wish, could still be granted. Eclipse, the one living thing that had never given up on him. "Thank you," Len said quietly, though the words felt weak, barely escaping his throat. He didn't unwrap the paper bag containing the cheeseburger, with extra pickles and the soda. The smell alone was enough to flood him with memories. He hadn't been hungry in days, and the mere sight of the food made his stomach churn. But he picked up the burger and took a sip of the soda anyway, trying to act normal. He remembered sitting at a diner with Helen years ago, laughing over a similar meal with Eclipse at their feet. That memory felt like a lifetime ago. Sitting on the narrow bunk, Len stared at the opposite wall. He wondered if Eclipse would even recognize him. Would the dog have moved on after 5 years? Would the bond still be there, or would it be lost to time? He didn't know. All he could do was hold on to that last thread of hope. If the warden had followed through with the request, maybe he would get a few moments of peace, just one last time, with the creature who had been his lifeline during the darkest days of his life. The door opened again, This time, it was Warden Batista, her expression grim and businesslike. Behind her stood Helen Griggs, holding Eclipse's leash. The moment the dog saw Len, something shifted in the air. Eclipse's entire body went rigid, as if he recognized Len instantly. Then, with a joyous bark that could only be described as a shout of happiness, Eclipse leapt forward. His nails clattered against the cold tiles as he tried to reach Len, his tail wagging furiously. The dog let out a mixture of barks, whines, and yelps, his excitement overflowing in a flood of emotion. Len's breath caught in his throat, and he dropped to his knees. "Obs my parass," unable to stop the tears that welled up in his eyes. "Eclipse," Len whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, holding him tight. The German shepherd licked at his face, his tongue warm and familiar, a comfort Len had longed for. The dog's fur was thicker now, his muzzle dusted with streaks of white that hadn't been there before. But the dog's eyes, the same striking ice-blue eyes, looked up at him with the same love and devotion that had always been there. "For you." Helen stood back by the door, trembling. She hadn't moved from the spot where she stood. Flight. Huff. From. Pout, her hand clutching the leash as she watched Len and Eclipse reunite. It was too much for her to bear, but she couldn't tear herself away. She felt the weight of everything they had lost together. All the years of hope and pain condensed into this one bittersweet moment. Len looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Helen," he said, his heart aching at the sight of her. Words failed him. How could he explain the depth of everything he was feeling in that moment? Foul. The anger, the guilt, the grief, it was all too much. She had fought so hard to bring him here, to get him this one last moment with Eclipse, and now all he had was a lifetime of pain to offer her. "I tried to stop this," Helen whispered, her voice cracking as she finally spoke. "I begged them to look again. No one would listen." Her eyes were filled with guilt, but Len shook his head. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You did more than anyone." The warden cleared her throat, stepping forward. "We have sure 2 minutes," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The chaplain will come afterward, and then the doctor." "I'm sorry, Jackson." Len tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He wanted to say more, but he couldn't. Words couldn't convey what he was feeling. He was here, with Helen and Eclipse, for the first time in years. It felt like a stolen moment of peace, a chance to breathe before the inevitable. As the minutes passed, neither Len nor Helen spoke. They simply sat in silence, Eclipse curled up at their feet, content in the warmth of their presence. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Forcible, the outside world, with all its chaos, injustice, and heartache, couldn't touch them here. The door opened again, and Chaplain Morris entered, his soft footsteps echoing in the small space. He smiled gently at the scene before him, offering a respectful nod. "Mr. Jackson, may I come in?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Len looked up at him and nodded, still unable to speak. Morris set down a small Bible on the table and pulled up a chair next to him. "I hear they're preparing the chamber," the chaplain said, his voice low and soothing. "But I wanted to be with you. Unless you'd prefer otherwise?" Len managed a small, shaky smile. "No," he whispered. "I'm glad you're here, Chaplain." And so they prayed. Or rather, Morris prayed, and Len listened. His thoughts were far from the words being spoken. He thought about his late mother, who had always taught him about redemption, about faith and forgiveness. How would she feel now, knowing her son was about to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. The sadness of the thought was overwhelming, and he let the tears fall freely, not caring how much time was left. The door clicked open again. Warden Batista's voice, sharp and quick, broke through the silence. "Chaplain, I need a moment with Mr. Jackson." Morris gave Len a curious glance, but stepped aside without protest. Batista's face was conflicted, torn between duty and something else Len couldn't quite name. "Jackson," she said, her voice more gentle than he had expected, "we've received new information that could call your involvement in Kincaid's murder into question." Len froze. "New information? Could it be possible?" Batista continued, her voice tight. "On that basis, I've secured a short postponement of the injection. 2 hours starting now." Len's heart pounded in his chest. "Postponement? What does that mean?" "It means," Batista said, her expression softening, "you're not dying at Juling. Not today, at least. The procedure is on hold until Yi Ling. We need to verify the authenticity of new financial records that may indicate you were framed. If they check out, the governor could grant a formal stay, and we might open an investigation." Len blinked, his mind reeling. For the first time in years, hope surged in his chest. Could this be real? Could they finally be seeing the truth? "Are you serious?" Len whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been saying I was innocent from the start, and now finally, someone believes me?" Batista exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "This isn't confirmation of innocence yet, but there's reason to doubt the validity of your conviction. Detective Delacroix is pushing for a thorough review." Len's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and anger. 5 years, he thought. 5 years of my life wasted. For a crime I didn't commit. The door closed behind Batista as she left, and Len sank back onto the narrow bed, his mind whirling. There was a chance. A real chance. The chaplain returned to his seat beside Len, a gentle presence in the room. "This could be the miracle we prayed for," he whispered. Len nodded, his thoughts heavy. "I didn't want to hope," he murmured. "But maybe, just maybe, this is it." The minutes stretched into an agonizing silence. Len couldn't seem to focus on anything other than the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second felt like it dragged him further from the peace he had just found. Helen was gone now, and he was alone, waiting for. His thoughts flickered between the past and the present, between the ghost of the life he had lost and the thin thread of hope that now seemed to hover in the air. He thought about the past 5 years, the relentless sense of being trapped, surrounded by cold walls and iron bars, the constant reminder that he had been condemned for a crime he didn't commit. He had shouted his innocence until his voice was hoarse, but no one had listened. The world had moved on, leaving him to rot in a cell. Even his own friends and family had turned away, except for Helen. She had stood by him when everyone else had turned their backs. She was the one constant in this nightmare. She had never wavered in her belief that he was innocent, even when everything seemed to be against him. But now it seemed like the world might be listening. Could this really be the end of his nightmare? Could he actually be exonerated? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. If they found the truth, if the new evidence proved his innocence, then what would happen next? What kind of life would he have left after all these years of isolation? Would he even know how to live outside these prison walls? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood up quickly, his heart racing. The door opened, and Officer Garcia stepped in, her expression neutral but still sympathetic. "They've granted the postponement," she said quietly, her tone almost apologetic. You have 2 hours. They'll update you with what happens next." She didn't say anything else, just stood there, watching him. Len nodded, still trying to process what he had just heard. 2 hours. That was all he had. But it was a chance. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a real chance to prove his innocence, to get out of this place. After a moment, Garcia left, leaving Len alone again with his thoughts. He paced the small cell, trying to shake off the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The silence felt deafening now. The hum of the fluorescent light above the only sound in the room. He thought about Helen. She had been there for him every step of the way. She had fought for him. Even when the world had turned its back on him, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her behind, of not being there for her the way she had been there for him. But now there was hope. It wasn't over yet, and the possibility of being free again, of walking out of debt here and starting over, seemed almost too much to bear. The door opened again, and this time it was Warden Batista. She stood in the doorway for a moment, studying him, before stepping inside. She wasn't alone. Detective Anton Delacqua stood just behind her, a somber look on his face. "Jackson," Batista said, her voice more serious now, "I have some new information. Your case, it's been reopened. There's a chance we can stop the execution. The governor's office has granted a 2-hour delay, but it's not over. There's still work to do." Len's heart skipped a beat. His eyes locked with Delacqua's, and for the first time since his arrest, he saw something in the detective's eyes, something that resembled guilt, or perhaps remorse. Anton had been the one who led the investigation that put Len here. He had been the one who helped frame him, but now he was standing here, on his side. "I know this isn't much," Delacqua said, his voice steady, but there was a tremor in it. "But I've been looking at the case again. There are things I missed. Things we all missed." Len shook his head, unable to fully comprehend what he was hearing. "What do you mean?" "You helped put me here. You were the one who led the investigation. How can I trust you now?" Delacqua's face tightened. "I made mistakes, big ones, and I should have come forward sooner, but I didn't. I didn't want to ruin my career, and I didn't want to admit that we got it wrong. But I can't sit by and watch you die for something you didn't do." The words felt like a slap to the face. Len didn't know what to say. Anger burned in his chest, but there was also something else, something he couldn't quite place. Could he trust Delacqua? Could he trust anyone anymore? Batista stepped forward, her gaze flicking between the two men. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice clipped. "The clock is ticking. We've got 2 hours to confirm whether this new evidence is legitimate. If it is, we'll halt the execution. But it's not guaranteed. We have to act fast." Len nodded, feeling a mix of hope and fear well up inside him. He had waited so long for a break, but now that it was finally here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He wasn't sure if he could handle the possibility of freedom or the crushing weight of failure if the evidence didn't pan out. "We're going to do everything we can," Batista said, her tone softer now, "but it's not going to be easy. The governor's office is involved, and we need more than just speculation. We need concrete evidence." Delacqua spoke up again. "I'm in contact with a digital forensics team. They're working on tracing financial records that tie the victim, Kincaid, to some shell companies that could have been used to frame Len. If we can find a link, it could prove his innocence." Len looked at both of them, his throat tight. "And if you don't find it, then the execution goes forward," Batista said bluntly. "But we're not giving up." Len sank back onto the bunk, his mind whirling with 1,000 thoughts. 2 hours. That was all he had. 2 hours to prove his innocence, 2 hours to change everything. He looked at Delacqua, at the man who had once been his enemy, now standing beside him. "Do you think we can actually do it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Delacroix met his gaze, his face serious. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to try." The room fell into a heavy silence as Len closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. For the first time in a long while, there was something in the air, something that resembled hope. The tension in the holding cell was almost unbearable. As Len sat on the narrow metal bed, his hands trembling slightly as they rested in his lap, Warden Batista and Detective Delacroix had left him alone for a while to make their calls, to chase down the new evidence that could potentially save his life. The minutes passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last, and the sound of his own heartbeat filled the quiet. 2 hours. That was all they had, and it felt like an eternity. 2 hours to change the course of his entire life. It was both a gift and a curse. He couldn't help but think of what had led him to this moment. 5 years on death row. 5 years of hearing the same words over and over, "You're guilty." 5 years of feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The crushing isolation of prison life and the relentless pain of being separated from everything he had once known. Bull, his freedom, his family, his dog, Eclipse, they had all been ripped away from him in an instant. But now there was a glimmer of hope, the possibility, no matter how small, that he could walk out of here, that he could be free again. Felt almost too much to bear, but the fear lingered too. What if this was just another cruel trick? What if the truth didn't come out, and he was condemned to die anyway? What if the system, so quick to lock him up, couldn't be persuaded to let him go? The sound of footsteps outside the door snapped him out of his thoughts. The door opened, and Warden Batista stepped inside. Behind her, Detective Delacroix followed, his face grim but determined. "We have something," Batista said, her voice tight with urgency. She glanced at Len for a brief moment before turning to Delacroix. "Tell him." Delacroix stepped forward, his face pale but focused. "We've found something. A link, financial transactions between Concade and several shell companies. Companies that were used to funnel money to a third party. And those transactions coincide with the timeline of the murder." Len's heart skipped a beat. "A third party?" he echoed, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Delacroix nodded. "Yes, we're still piecing everything together, but it looks like Concade had enemies. Real ones, with the means and motive to kill him. The money trail leads to one of them, Walton Green, a man with a reputation for getting his hands dirty. We're still confirming details, but it's a start." Len felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the reality of the situation. "So what does this mean? Are you saying someone else killed Concade? That I was framed?" "It's possible," Batista said, her voice serious. "We don't have definitive proof yet, but the evidence is pointing in that direction. We've sent everything to the governor's office. If they can verify the transactions and confirm the link, there's a chance we can stop the execution." Len closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had ever had before. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a fighting chance. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. What if it wasn't enough? What if it was too little, too late? Delacroix seemed to sense his doubt. "We've still got work to do," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything they were up against. "Fiending, but we're moving forward. And we're going to make sure your case gets the attention it deserves." Len nodded slowly, trying to keep the flicker of hope alive. He had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to feel. His stomach was tight with anxiety, but there was also a spark of something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "Thank you," Len said, his voice hoarse, "for doing this. For believing in me, Batista gave a small nod. "We're not done yet, Jackson. But we'll do everything we can." The door closed behind them, leaving Len alone again in the cold, sterile cell. He walked over to the small window and stared out at the gray morning sky. Inside. It was still early, the light dim and pale, but it seemed to offer a faint promise of something better. He didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The next few minutes passed in a haze for Len. He could hear the distant hum of activity outside his cell, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the faint murmur of voices, but none of it seemed to reach him. His mind was elsewhere, racing through every possible scenario. He had never been good at waiting, but now it was all he could do. Wait and hope. Wait for a phone call, for the next piece of evidence, for the answer that would decide his fate. The guard had come in briefly to check on him, but he had barely registered the interaction. What was the point? It was all out of his hands now. He had done everything he could, shouted his innocence, refused to accept his fate, bong dog, begged for a chance to see his dog. Eclipse was the only thing that had kept him tethered to the world outside these walls. But now, even the possibility of a future, a life, seemed so far removed from the life he had once known. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of the intercom, followed by the voice of Officer Garcia. "Jackson, Warden Batista wants to see you." His pulse quickened. Was this it? The decision was finally being made. He stood quickly, wiping his hands against his jumpsuit, a nervous habit. The shackles clinked as he walked toward the door, the sound hollow in the stillness. When he entered the hallway, Garcia was standing by the door, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She gave him a small nod and gestured for him to step forward. Len felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he walked toward Warden Batista's office. His thoughts raced. What if they hadn't found anything? What if it was all just another false hope? The door to Batista's office was slightly ajar, and as he stepped inside, he saw her and Detective Delacqua standing near a desk, their faces serious. "Jackson," Batista said as she looked up from the papers in front of her. "We've received some new developments." Len's heart skipped. Could it be? Was this finally happening? Delacqua stepped forward, his face lined with exhaustion, but also a glimmer of cautious optimism. "We've been able to trace the financial records. There's a clear link to Walton Green. He's a fixer, someone with connections to Kincaid's enemies. The transactions point to him being involved in setting you up." Len's breath caught in his throat. A fixer. The word echoed in his mind. It was starting to make sense. Kincaid's enemies, the shady dealings, the financial discrepancies, it was all coming together. "We've got a statement from a source," Delacqua continued. "It confirms that Green was hired to stage the murder, to frame you for it. We've got bank transfers, phone records, and even surveillance footage. We're still working on piecing it all together, but it's undeniable now. You were set up." Len closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a wave. For the first time in years, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. "So, I'm innocent?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You really think I didn't do it?" Delacqua met his gaze, his expression softening. "Len, I know it doesn't change everything, but yes, I believe you." Batista stepped forward, her voice firm but more compassionate than before. "We've sent everything to the governor's office. If they can verify the evidence, they'll grant a formal stay. It's not over yet, Jackson, but we're fighting for you. We're not giving up." Len felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, disbelief, anger at the years that had been stolen from him. He had always known, deep down, that he hadn't committed that murder. But hearing the words from Delacqua, hearing them so plainly, was more than he could have ever hoped for. "I don't even know what to say," he said quietly, his throat tight with emotion. This isn't real. After everything, after all this time?" "It's real," Batista said. "We're doing everything we can to make sure the execution doesn't go forward. But we need more time. You need to hold on." He nodded slowly, barely able to process everything. Then he had been ready to die, had resigned himself to his fate. Now, there was a chance. But a chance at what? Freedom? Redemption? Could he rebuild his life after everything that had been taken from him? The door opened behind him, and Helen stepped in. Her eyes were wide with concern. But when she saw him standing there, a small smile flickered on her face. She rushed forward, pulling him into a tight embrace. Len's arms went around her instinctively, as if they were the only things that mattered in the world. "You're not dead," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not dead, Len. They found the truth. They finally found it." Len held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, grounding him. This was real. This was happening. His heart swelled with a mixture of hope and fear. What if it didn't work out? What if this was another false lead? He couldn't bear the thought of getting his hopes up, only to have them dashed once again. But, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that there was a chance that maybe he wouldn't die today. Maybe the truth could still win. "I didn't want to believe it," Helen said, pulling back slightly to look him in the eyes. "But now there's proof. I never stopped believing in you." Len's heart broke all over again. She had been through so much. She had fought for him, even when everyone else had given up. And now, for the first time, she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. But there was still so much to do. There was still a chance that the system would fail them again. He couldn't let himself get too comfortable with the idea of freedom just yet. But for now, he had something he hadn't had in years. Hope. The door opened again, and Warden Batista's voice broke through the moment. "Jackson, we have news from the governor's office. We've been granted a 2-hour stay of execution, but we still need to confirm the new evidence before we can make any final decisions." Len closed his eyes, a sense of disbelief washing over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a real shot at surviving this. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but at least now there was something to fight for. The next 2 hours would be the longest of his life, but for the first time, they were filled with a fragile hope. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each passing second, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Len stood in his cell, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened. The 2-hour stay was a temporary reprieve, but it gave him a chance. It gave him something he hadn't had in years: hope. A chance to prove his innocence. A chance to see his life, or at least a piece of it, restored. Helen stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm, her presence a steady reminder of everything he had fought for. But even as she squeezed his hand, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. It wasn't over yet. There were still so many obstacles to overcome. The governor's office had only given them 2 hours, but it wasn't enough time to clear everything up. There was still so much left to confirm, so much left to prove. "Do you think this is it?" Len asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know if he was speaking to Helen, to himself, or to the universe at large. Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion and the weight of all the years they had spent apart. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But we have to believe it is. We have to believe that it's not too late." Len nodded, Though doubt gnawed at the back of his mind, the governor's office had granted them 2 hours, but there was no guarantee that the evidence would be enough. It was also fragile. The evidence Delacroix had found, the financial records, the link to Walton Green, the testimony from sources that pointed to a frame job. Could it really be enough to overturn everything? He couldn't help but think back to the trial, to the way everything had seemed stacked against him. The fingerprints on the weapon, the questionable witness statements, the supposed financial motive. The prosecution had built a case that seemed airtight, convincing everyone, including himself, that he was guilty. He had shouted his innocence to anyone who would listen, but no one had believed him. And now, after all this time, it was coming down to this, to these 2 hours. It felt like the universe had finally given him a small window of hope. But what if that hope was just an illusion? A sharp knock at the door broke through his thoughts. It was Officer Garcia, her face tight with the weight of the situation. "Warden Batista wants to see you." "Now," she said, her voice clipped. Len's stomach dropped. Was this it? The moment when everything came crashing down? Or was it the moment he had been waiting for? The moment that would change everything? He looked at Helen, who nodded, her eyes filled with determination. I'll be right here," she said softly. "You're not alone." With a deep breath, Len followed Garcia out of the cell, the shackles around his ankles clinking with every step. As they walked down the cold, sterile hallway, his mind raced again. He had come this far. He couldn't let himself falter now. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything he had lost. When they reached the office, Warden Batista was standing by the door, her face a mask of professional detachment. But when she saw Len, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though she was silently acknowledging the significance of this moment. "Jackson," she said, her voice low and steady, "we've heard back from the governor's office. We've got some good news." Len felt his heart skip a beat. "What does that mean? Are we stopping the execution?" Batista looked him in the eye, her expression softening just slightly. "It means we've got more time. The governor has granted a temporary stay of execution. We have 2 hours to finish the investigation. But this is it, Jackson. This is your chance." A flood of relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by an overwhelming sense of disbelief. He wasn't being executed today. He wasn't going to die in the next few hours. There was time to prove his innocence, time to find the truth. Helen stepped into the room just then, her eyes wide with shock. "What's happening? Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Len turned to her, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in days. "We've got about hours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've got more time." Helen's breath hitched and tears welled up in her eyes. "Call. Oh, Shing is sashant." She rushed forward and hugged him tightly, as though she could somehow hold on to this moment forever. "I knew it. I knew we could do this." Len held her close, his heart still racing. There was so much to be done, so many loose ends to tie up, so many questions still unanswered. But for now, they had time. The execution wasn't happening today. He wasn't going to die today. Batista stepped back, giving them a moment to themselves. "You have 2 hours, Jackson," she said quietly. "We'll do everything we can to help you. But don't waste it. Use the time wisely, and we'll be watching closely. We need to know that the new evidence checks out." Len nodded, his mind still spinning. "I will," he said, his voice determined. "I'm not giving up. Not now." With that, Batista left the room, closing the door behind her. Len stood there, his arms still wrapped around Helen, trying to process what had just happened. Hours. Off. It was more than he could have hoped for, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had time to fight for his life. Helen pulled back slightly, her hands resting on his shoulders. "I know this isn't over," she said softly, "but for now, it feels like we've won. We have time." "That's everything," Len smiled, though it was a weary smile. "We have time," he echoed, "and that's enough. We'll get through this. Together." As they stood there, in the quiet of the room, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to lift just a little. They had more time to find the truth, more time to fix what had been broken, more time to live. For the first time in years, Len felt like he had something to hold on to, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that there might be a future for him. After all, the next stir-by hours felt like a whirlwind. Time moved in both slow and fast motion as Len found himself caught in the maze of investigation, hope, and tension. The reprieve from the execution had given him a sliver of freedom, but it wasn't enough. He was still in prison, still shackled to his past, and there was no guarantee that the new evidence would be enough to overturn his conviction. Every moment counted, every conversation held the weight of his future. Helen had remained by his side, helping to coordinate with the warden and Delacroix, making calls, seeking more information. She was relentless, her eyes never straying from the goal. But Len could see the strain in her face. She had carried so much for so long. The hope that had flooded him now weighed heavily on her too. By the time the second day of the stay had arrived, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Delacroix had worked tirelessly, tracking down more financial records, following leads, confirming details about Walton Green's connections. He was still piecing things together, but it was starting to look more and more like Kincaid had been a target, someone who had rubbed the wrong people the wrong way. Green's involvement seemed undeniable now. There was even a chance that the witnesses who had testified against Len had been coached, giving false statements. But none of this was proof. Not yet. Lang sat in the small, sterile room where they had placed him, waiting for the next update. The hours dragged by, his mind wandering through the memories of everything that had happened. The trial, the arrest, the years on death row. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the scars from that time still haunted him. He had been so sure, at first, that he wouldn't make it. He had spent so much time trying to accept the idea of dying. But now, there was hope. The door to his cell opened, and Officer Garcia stepped inside. "Jackson, Warden Batista wants you in her office," she said. Her voice clipped, but there was a note of urgency to it. Len's stomach twisted in knots. Was it good news or bad? Had they found something more? Or had everything fallen apart? As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the weight of each step. He knew that the time was running out. The governor's stay was only temporary. If they didn't get the confirmation they needed, if the evidence didn't hold up, it would all be for nothing. He reached the warden's office and was ushered inside. Batista and Delacroix were standing by the desk, their faces grim. It was clear they had been working nonstop. "Jackson," Batista said, her tone professional but softer than usual. "We've received the final report from the governor's office. The evidence you provided, financial transactions, witness statements, everything, has been verified." Len felt his heart stop. Verified? Was this the moment? Could it really be happening? Delacroix stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "We've confirmed that Walton Green was indeed involved. The shell companies, the bank transfers, everything lines up. We also traced a key piece of evidence that links him directly to Kincaid's murder. There's no question now. You were framed. Len's knees nearly buckled under the weight of the words. For so long, he had lived with the crushing doubt that no one would ever believe him, that his life would end with a needle in his arm. His name forever tainted, and now, finally, someone, two people, believed him. But there was still a part of him that couldn't fully accept it. This was too good to be true. The nightmare of the last 5 years had left him with a lingering fear that everything could be ripped away just as quickly as it had been given. Now, Batista continued, her voice more steady now. The governor's office has officially granted a full stay of execution, Jackson. They've reviewed the new evidence and are calling for an immediate reopening of your case. You will not be executed today. You will be given a hearing. Len could hardly believe what he was hearing. The words were sinking in slowly, as if they were coming from a distant place. A hearing? Wasn't going to die today? His heart began to pound in his chest. The weight of everything that had been stolen from him, pressing down on him once more. There was still so much left to do, but for now, there was something he had never thought he would have again, a chance. Thank you, he whispered, the words coming out thick and choked. He didn't know what else to say. He couldn't even wrap his mind around it all. He had been ready to die. He had accepted it, and now everything was different. Batista gave a curt nod. This isn't over. You still have to go through the process. But for now, you're not dying. You have time. Helen entered the room just then, her face pale, but her eyes bright with disbelief. Len, she said softly, almost as if she couldn't believe it herself. Len turned to her, a tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered, I'm not going to die, Helen. I'm not. Helen rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him. You're free, she whispered into his ear. You're going to be free. Len held her tightly, unable to speak for him. There were no words that could capture what he was feeling. For the first time in years, he felt something other than dread. He felt like he had a future again. The warden stepped back, giving them a moment. You have Shaba hours to get ready, she said. We'll move you to a new cell for now, and we'll update you with what happens next. Helen held Len's hand as they left the office, walking down the long hallway together. It was a strange feeling. The weight of his shackles no longer a constant reminder of his impending death. Now, for the first time, he felt like he could breathe again. They stopped at the small window of his new cell, and Len looked out at the sky. The first hint of the sun's warmth was reaching across the horizon, the Ashkali painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a sight he had almost forgotten, something so simple, so natural, but now it felt like a gift. He let out a shaky breath, the reality of his situation settling in. Everything's going to be okay, Helen said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. We'll get through this. Together, Len smiled softly. His sigh softly, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe it was true. They would get through this. He would get through this. For the first time in 5 years, Len Jackson had hope. Hope? The next few days felt like they were moving in slow motion. Len had been moved to a different cell, one that was quieter and farther away from the execution chamber. The stark, white walls of the new cell didn't feel as suffocating as the ones he'd lived in for so long. He had been given a chance to take a step back, to breathe, and to focus on something other than the imminent threat of death. The guard, though still stern, had seemed less detached. Maybe it was the fact that Len wasn't about to die that gave the man a certain level of humanity. Maybe it was just the circumstances. Regardless, the silence in the room was different now, with the constant feeling of a clock ticking down, replaced by the weight of waiting for answers. It felt like the waiting was almost harder now than the time he had spent on death row. His thoughts constantly drifted back to the day they had received the news. The governor's office had granted a full stay of execution, and the case was being reopened. Walton Green's involvement, the financial records, the new testimony, it was all coming together in a way that Len hadn't thought possible. But there was still so much to do. Helen had been in constant contact with Detective Delacroix, working on getting the final pieces of the case confirmed. They were moving quickly, gathering as much information as they could. It felt like a small victory, but there was still no guarantee that the evidence would be enough to fully exonerate Len. He couldn't afford to get too comfortable. He spent most of the day sitting by the small window in his cell, staring out at the world beyond the prison walls. The sky was blue, the air clear, so different from the cold, sterile environment he had been trapped in for so long. Boopy, the sound of birds in the distance, was a reminder of everything he had missed. It had been stolen from him. He used to walk eclipse through these streets. He remembered the early mornings when they would go for a walk, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. It was a simple pleasure, one that he could barely recall now, but the memory still tugged at his heart. He had wanted to walk eclipse down Redwood Creek again, to feel the freedom of life outside these walls. But was that even possible now, after everything? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Officer Garcia entered. "Jackson," she said, her tone almost gentle, "Warden Bautista wants to see you." Len stood quickly, a wave of anxiety rushing through him. What now? Was this the moment when everything fell apart? He could feel the tension in his shoulders as he followed Garcia down the hallway, the sound of his shackles echoing in the silence. He entered the warden's office, where Batista and Delacroix were already waiting. The look on their faces was serious, but there was something else there, too, something that made Len's heart race. "Jackson," Batista said, her voice low but steady, "we've received an update from the governor's office, reviewed everything, and I'm pleased to tell you that we've confirmed enough of the evidence to take the next step." Len's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" His voice was hoarse, the weight of his words sitting heavy in the air. Delacroix stepped forward, a grim smile on his face. "It means your conviction is about to be overturned. We've confirmed Walton Green's involvement, and we've traced the evidence back to a much larger conspiracy. There's no question now, Jackson. You're innocent." For a moment, the words didn't register. It was almost too much to take in. "I'm innocent?" Len repeated, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Yes," Batista confirmed. "The charges against you are being dropped. We're going to get you out of here." Len staggered back, his mind spinning. For 5 years, he had lived with the crushing weight of guilt and fear, constantly fighting to prove that he hadn't committed the crime he was accused of. He had spent so long in a place where hope seemed like a distant memory. And now, after everything, it was real. He wasn't going to die. He wasn't going to stay locked up. "I can't believe it," Len whispered, his voice shaking. "After all this time, I never thought this would happen." Delacroix nodded, his expression serious. "It wasn't easy, Jackson. But we're here now. The DA's office is moving to vacate your conviction. You'll be released soon." Helen, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. "Len," she said, her voice thick with tears, "I knew it. I always knew." Len looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. She had never given up on him, even when it seemed like the whole world had. She had fought for him, for his innocence, for their future. And now, they finally had it. "I can't believe this is happening," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never thought I'd see the day." "You will," Batista said, her voice firm. "But don't get ahead of yourself. You've been through a lot, Jackson. There's still paperwork, still the formalities, but we'll make sure it happens." Len nodded slowly, trying to absorb everything that was happening. He could hardly process it. He had spent so long preparing for death. To think he would ever have a chance at a normal life again felt impossible. But it was happening. The future was opening up before him, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like the walls were closing in. Helen reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We're going to figure this out, Len, together." Len smiled through his tears, his grip on her hand firm and steady. "I'm ready," he said, his voice filled with more conviction than he had ever felt before, to finally live. As the door to the warden's office closed behind them, Len felt something shift inside him. The world outside the prison walls was no longer a distant dream. It was within his reach. He had a future now, a future with Helen, with Eclipse, and with the life he had been denied for so long. And this time, he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. The days that followed were a blur of legal procedures and tense waiting. Len was still technically behind bars, though it felt different now. His conviction was on the verge of being overturned, and the walls around him, which had once felt like an impenetrable prison, now felt like a temporary setback. He couldn't ignore the fact that he had already spent years of his life in this place, but for the first time, he saw a way out. Helen had been his lifeline, continuing to press for justice on his behalf. She spent countless hours talking to attorneys, making calls to the district attorney's office, Wyvern, Aves, Sty, and communicating with Delacroix, who had become a staunch ally. With each passing day, the paperwork moved through the legal channels. Slowly, but surely. The system, slow and bureaucratic as it was, seemed to be moving in Len's favor. But as the days wore on, Len's unease grew. Despite the overwhelming evidence that had come to light, the confirmation of Walton Green's role in framing him and the DA's willingness to drop the charges, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had been wrongfully convicted once before. What if it happened again? What if, at the last minute, something fell through and he was denied the freedom he had fought so hard to reclaim? He sat by the small window in his cell, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the prison yard. He couldn't help but think of everything he had lost. The years, the opportunities, the life he could have had. But as the darkness crept over the yard, he felt something else, something new. A flicker of hope, however fragile, was growing inside him. It wasn't just a faint light at the end of the tunnel anymore. It was something he could reach out and touch. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood quickly, his heart racing. "Jackson," came Garcia's voice from the other side. "The warden wants to see you." Len's mind immediately went into overdrive. Was this it? The decision? He felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead as he followed Garcia down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, and his shackles clinked in the silence, an almost mocking reminder of how much time he had spent here. When they reached the warden's office, Len was ushered inside. Batista and Delacroix were standing by the desk, their expressions unreadable. And Helen was there too, sitting in a chair with a hopeful, yet nervous, look in her eyes. "Jackson," Batista said, her voice steady but filled with a slight edge of anticipation. "We've just heard back from the courts." Len's heart jumped in his chest. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse with tension. Delacqua stepped forward, a brief flash of something like relief crossing his face. "It means you're free, Jackson. The court has ruled. Your conviction has been overturned. You're being released immediately." Len blinked, his breath catching in his throat. "I'm free?" Helen stood up quickly, rushing toward him and wrapping her arms around him. Len stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening. Heartache, a feeling like he had been lost to the system, all seemed to collapse in that single moment. "Yes," she whispered into his ear. "You're free. We did it. It's over." Len's arms went around her instinctively, holding her tightly. He could feel the weight of the past 5 years, lifting the darkness, slowly dissipating. He wasn't just alive. He was free. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed full of possibility. Batista's voice broke through the moment. "You'll be escorted out of the prison within the hour. You're no longer a prisoner." Len turned toward her, still trying to process what he had just heard. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Now," Batista said with a nod, "you get your life back. You'll be given some time to adjust, but there are still legal processes ahead. To compensation, and there may be further investigations into the corruption that led to your conviction." "Thank you," Len said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure if he was thanking her for what had just happened or for giving him a chance to live again. Delacqua, who had been standing quietly, spoke up. "I'll be following up with the DA's office. We still have a lot of work ahead, but at least now you can move forward. You're not bound to the past anymore." Len nodded, his mind racing. The idea of starting over was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had spent so long in this place, so long believing that he would never see the world outside these walls again. And now he was going to be released into it. There was so much he didn't know. So much had changed in 5 years. What would life be like? How could he begin again? Helen squeezed his hand, her voice soft but full of determination. "We'll figure it out together," she said, "one step at a time." "You're not alone." Len smiled at her, the weight of everything that had happened finally hitting him. He was free. He wasn't just escaping from prison. He was escaping from a past that had held him in its grip for far too long. As the officers began preparing for his release, Len took one final look at the prison around him. It was hard to believe it was finally over, that he was finally going to walk out of here. But he wasn't walking out alone. He had Helen and Eclipse, who he had not seen in far too long, waiting for him outside. "I'll see you soon," Len whispered to the prison walls. "This is the last time I'll look at you." And just like that, the door was opened. He was stepping out of the life that had been forced upon him and into a new one, a life that still had a chance. The gray, dismal light filtered through the narrow windows of Ironwood State Prison, a faint glow, as if even the sun hesitated to cast its warmth into this place. Filled with cold tragedies, the guards patrolled the corridors in a familiar rhythm, their boots clacking steadily against the concrete floor. The surrounding walls, painted a pale hospital green, only deepened the oppressive silence. In one of the high-security cells, Leonard Len Jackson was handcuffed to an iron bed, alone in a world that seemed to be closing in around him. A ceiling bulb cast harsh light on his face, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his features. He hadn't slept well for a week, Not since the final order was issued. Tomorrow would be the fateful day. When the sun rose, he would be moved to the last cell, the cold one, next to the punishment chamber. T. 2 hours later, the heaviest penalty would be carried out. He had no visitors, no family, only the occasional presence of Reverend Morris, the prison chaplain, one of the few sources of comfort in his final weeks. Len's last wish remained unchanged. "I want to see Eclipse before I go." He had told the guard outside his cell, perhaps 100 times. Eclipse was the German shepherd he had adopted 3 years before his arrest. A bounty around, and the bond between them was deeper than anything he could express. That dog was his companion, his solace. In a life turned upside down, Warden Mara Batista appeared at the door of his cell. Her posture was rigid, professional, but her eyes held a faint softness, as if hiding something more. She harbored no illusions about the man before her. Yet, she afforded him a certain respect, albeit reluctantly. "Jackson," she began, her voice calm, "final requests have to be approved. You understand that, don't you? Bringing an animal onto prison grounds isn't standard procedure, and right now, we don't even know where the dog is." Len's voice was hoarse, rough, from long silence. "I know where he is," he interrupted, a spark of desperation in his tone. "Eclipse is with Helen Griggs, my fiancée. She's still got him. She'd never give him up." He swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "Please, Warden, if you can let me see him, it's the only thing I'm asking for." Warden Batista studied him for a moment, her gaze betraying a flicker of sympathy, though she quickly masked it with her usual sternness. "I'll see what I can do," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But don't get your hopes up." She turned and walked away, but in Len's heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered. As the warden left, Len's mind drifted. For 5 long years, he had shouted his innocence to anyone who would listen. But the walls of Ironwood Prison seemed to swallow his voice, leaving the truth as a mere whisper amid the roar of his sentence. Reverend Morris believed him to some extent, but the world outside, the courts, the public, those who once knew him, had all turned a deaf ear to his pleas. No one believed him, and time was running out. The only person who still believed in his possible innocence was Helen. But even she was powerless. She could only watch the clock tick down to his final moments. Len closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold steel bed. He could hear the guards' voices echoing from the hallway outside. "Half think he's guilty," one said. "The other half just want the heaviest penalty gone altogether." Those words didn't matter. They wouldn't change anything. In just a few hours, the needle would end it all. Len forced himself to sit up from the bed and shuffled to the small window in his cell. It was a narrow slit high on the wall, just wide enough to glimpse a sliver of sky. Not much, but it was something. A faint, pink glow was spreading across the horizon, the first sign of dawn. The soft morning light reminded him of walking Eclipse through the streets of Redwood City. Those were precious moments he had cherished. Those were precious moments, her precious moments he had cherished. Before everything fell apart, he could almost picture the dog bounding around him, tail wagging furiously, ears perked, eager for the new day. Those were carefree times. Before the prison bars closed around his life, the sound of a guard's knock snapped him back to reality. "Jackson, it's time," the guard called through the bars. "They're moving you to the last cell. The warden wants you ready." Len's heart sank. Was this it? Was he about to get his final wish? His throat tightened Words caught between his chest and mouth. Will I get to see Eclipse? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The guard hesitated for a moment. I don't know. They're checking with the Department of Corrections. Don't hope too much. With a resigned nod, Len turned, offering his hands to be cuffed. After all these years, he was too familiar with the cold clink of metal tightening around his wrists. He had no strength left to resist. He had stopped fighting. After all this time, it didn't matter anymore. As he was led down the hallway, P.K. Len glanced back one last time at the window. The streak of morning light shimmered in the space, as if the sun were waiting for something. Waiting for him, perhaps, to see the world one more time. He didn't know if he would feel that warmth again, but the thought lingered in his heart. A final wish, faint and fragile. Clara shrugged, a mix of disbelief and determination in her expression. Sounds like he's seen the writing on the wall. If that second forensic report was suppressed, and with the phone logs tying Walton Pierce to the scene, the judge might release you on bail, or even drop the charges if the evidence is strong enough. Len squeezed her hands, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. You didn't sleep either, did you? She gave a small laugh, tears brimming. I'd stay up forever if it meant getting you out of here. A bailiff appeared, his voice cutting through the moment. Let's go. Judge Navarro's ready. The courtroom was quieter than Len expected, a tense hush hanging over the room. Judge Navarro, a stern woman with sharp eyes, presided from the bench. Len was led to the defense table, where a new attorney, Michael Torres, waited. Auntie Torres was from the public defender's office, assigned after Len's original lawyer retired. He had a determined glint in his eye, like someone ready to fight. Across the aisle, Hargrove sat alone, his usual air of confidence replaced by a somber focus. Behind him, Delgado held a stack of folders, his face etched with purpose. Warden Martinez and two representatives from the governor's council flanked the room, an unlikely alliance, united by the weight of a possible miscarriage of justice. Judge Navarro's voice was steady as she addressed the room. We're convened today to address new evidence in the conviction of Leonard Carter for the murder of Victor Ramsey. Mr. Hargrove, as the prosecuting attorney in the original trial, please summarize the developments. Hargrove stood, clearing his throat, his posture betraying a hint of unease. Your Honor, since the stay of execution was granted yesterday, significant findings have come to light. Phone records indicate a known fixer, Walton Pierce, was within a mile of the victim's penthouse at the time of the murder. Additionally, a second forensic report from the crime scene, never presented at trial, shows footprints not matching Mr. Carter, signs of forced entry, and traces of gunpowder residue inconsistent with the murder weapon. There's also evidence suggesting the partial fingerprint on the knife may have been transferred from another occasion. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Len's heart pounded, his mind struggling to process the words. Hargrove, the man who'd once painted him as a cold-blooded killer, was admitting the case was flawed. Judge Navarro's eyebrows arched. You're saying this forensic report was withheld? Hargrove's voice wavered slightly. I can't confirm who suppressed it, Your Honor, but it never reached me or the defense. Given these developments, the state concedes that Mr. Carter's conviction is no longer on solid ground. Len's breath caught. He glanced back at Clara, who was gripping the edge of her seat, her eyes wide with hope. A soft gasp escaped someone in the gallery. Maybe her, maybe a stranger. Judge Navarro turned to the defense. Mr. Torres, as Mr. Carter's counsel, do you have a motion? Torres rose, his voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. We move to vacate Mr. Carter's conviction and release him immediately, pending any potential retrial or dismissal. The state's admission of material flaws in the evidence supports this motion. Navarro's gaze shifted to Hargrove. Does the state oppose vacating the conviction? After a tense pause, Hargrove shook his head. We do not, Your Honor. The state will not proceed with the original verdict. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Then I see no reason to hold Mr. Carter further. She banged her gavel, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in Len's ears. Motion. Granted, Mr. Carter, you are hereby released on your own recognizance, pending any new charges the state might bring, which, from what I see, they have none. This court apologizes for the miscarriage of justice you've endured. The room erupted in applause. Len's vision blurred with tears as the guards removed his shackles, the metal falling away with a clatter. Clara rushed to him, throwing her arms around him in a fierce embrace. You're free, she whispered, her voice breaking. Delgado and Martinez exchanged relieved glances, while Hargrove stood silently, his face a mix of relief and regret. Len took a shaky breath, the weight of 5 years lifting, but leaving behind a strange, fragile freedom. He was no longer a condemned man, no longer a prisoner. He kissed Clara's forehead, his voice barely above a whisper. Let's go home. They stepped out of the courthouse into a bright midday sun, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold prison walls. Clara held Len's arm, guiding him gently, as if he might disappear. Camera crews were waiting, reporters shouting questions, their microphones thrust forward. Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be free? Do you have proof you were framed? Will you seek compensation? Len shielded his face, overwhelmed. Clara raised a hand. Please, no comment right now. We just need some space. A police officer stepped in, parting the crowd to clear a path to Clara's pickup truck. Inside, Shadow was waiting, his tail thumping against the seat. The moment Clara opened the door, the German shepherd leapt out, bounding toward Len with joyous barks. Len dropped to his knees, burying his face in Shadow's fur, tears streaming as he held the dog who'd been his lifeline through it all. The crowd watched, some snapping photos, others wiping their own eyes. At the sight of the reunion, Clara and Len climbed into the truck, ignoring the press. Creakle. As they pulled away, Len stared out the window at Redwood City, a place that felt both familiar and alien. New buildings had sprung up, old shops had vanished. The world kept moving, he murmured, a pang of loss mingling with hope. Clara reached for his hand. I'm here, she said softly. We'll figure it out together. You've got time now. Len nodded, resting a hand on Shadow's head. The dog panted happily between them, a living reminder of everything they'd fought for. Let's go to your place, Len said. I don't even have anywhere to stay. It's your home, too, Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. If you want it. I do, he said, his heart swelling with gratitude. The engine of Clara Evans's pickup truck hummed softly as she drove through the streets of Redwood City. The afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Leonard Carter sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on Shadow's head. The German shepherd sprawled happily between them. The city outside felt like a strange dream. New coffee shops had replaced old hardware stores. A sleek high-rise loomed where Len's favorite diner used to be, and the rhythm of life seemed to have quickened in his absence. But 5 years behind bars had changed everything, and Len was still grappling with the weight of his newfound freedom. Clara glanced at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. Len nodded, though his gaze was fixed on the world rushing by. "It's just a lot," he admitted. "Everything's different. I don't know where I fit anymore." His fingers tightened in Shadow's fur, the dog's steady warmth grounding him. "But having you and Shadow here, that's what's keeping me from losing it." Clara reached over, squeezing his hand. "We'll take it one step at a time, Len. You don't have to figure it all out today." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions she was trying to hold back. "You're home now. That's what matters." They pulled into the driveway of Clara's modest bungalow, a single-story house with a small, scrappy yard. Inside, the living room was a mix of cozy and cluttered. Half-packed boxes lined the walls, a reminder that Clara's life had been on hold too. Len stepped through the doorway, pausing to take it all in. A photo on the mantel caught his eye. Him and Clara on a hiking trail, Shadow bounding ahead, their smiles wide and carefree. It was taken just weeks before his arrest, a snapshot of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Clara followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "I couldn't bring myself to put that one away," she said softly. Even when things got hard, Len's throat tightened. "You kept it all this time," he murmured, crossing the room to touch the frame. "You never gave up on me. Never," Clara said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. She led him to a spare bedroom, a small space crowded with boxes but with a neatly made bed in the corner. "Nalai, I was planning to move soon, maybe somewhere with a bigger yard for Shadow, but if you want to stay here, I can break the lease. We can make this work." Len shook his head, overwhelmed by her willingness to upend her life for him. "Wenlin, no, don't change everything for me. I'm just grateful to be here, Clara, to not be in that cell." He sank onto the bed, Shadow padding over to lean against his leg. The German shepherd's blue eyes met his, steady and reassuring. "Falf," and Len felt a wave of gratitude for the dog who'd been his anchor through the darkest years. Clara sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "There's a lot to figure out," she said. "Reporters are already calling, wanting statements. Lawyers reached out about a possible lawsuit for wrongful conviction, but we don't have to deal with any of that right now. You need time to breathe." Later, Len agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need this moment." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, Shadow's soft breathing the only sound in the room. It was the kind of quiet Len hadn't known in years, free from the clank of cell doors or the murmur of guards. Then, a sharp vibration broke the stillness. Len glanced at the old phone Clara had given him. Her spare, a lifeline to the outside world. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Be careful. Ramsey's partners know you're out. They're not happy." Len's stomach dropped, a chill running through him. He showed the phone to Clara, whose eyes widened. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "No idea," Len said, his mind racing. "Could be a prank," or he trailed off, the weight of the message sinking in. Victor Ramsey, the man he'd been convicted of killing, had been a powerful figure with deep ties to Redwood City's elite. If someone had framed Len to cover up a larger conspiracy, his release might be a threat to those still hiding in the shadows. Clara's jaw tightened. "We need to tell Detective Delgado. He's been digging into this. Maybe he can trace the number." She grabbed her own phone, forwarding the message to Delgado with a quick note. "I'm not letting anyone hurt you again, Len. Not after everything." Len nodded, but the dread lingered. 5 years on death row had taught him to expect the worst, and this message felt like a dark echo of the forces that had stolen his life once before. He pocketed the phone and stood determined not to let fear define this moment. "Let's go to the living room," he said. "I need to be with you, not stuck in my head." They settled on the couch, shadow curling up at their feet. Clara turned on the TV, but the news was already buzzing with Len's story. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, her voice sharp with excitement. Leonard Carter, once hours from execution, was released today after new evidence cast doubt on his conviction. Sources say a suppressed forensic report and phone logs pointing to a fixer named Dot. Walton Pierce could unravel one of Redwood City's most high-profile cases. Worse. Clara muted the TV, her expression a mix of relief and frustration. "They're going to turn this into a circus," she muttered. "But we don't have to deal with them yet. Let's just be normal for a bit." Len managed a small smile. "Normal sounds good." He leaned back, letting the softness of the couch and the warmth of Shadow's presence sink in. For the first time in years, he wasn't counting down the minutes to his death. He was here, alive, with the two beings who'd kept him going. A fours ins all gross. Across town, Detective Anton Delgado sat in the dimly lit records room of the Redwood City Police Department, surrounded by dusty boxes from the Ramsey case. The air smelled of old paper and regret. When home, he'd spent hours combing through files, driven by a need to right the wrong he'd unknowingly helped perpetrate. The second forensic report, detailing unaccounted footprints, forced entry, and gunpowder residue, had been a bombshell, but it wasn't enough. He needed a direct link to Walton Pierce, the fixer whose phone logs placed him near Ramsey's penthouse the night of the murder. Delgado's phone buzzed with Clara's message about the mysterious text Len had received. His jaw tightened as he read it. "Ramsey's partners," he muttered. The warning suggested the conspiracy ran deeper than he'd feared. Bile, possibly involving powerful figures who'd benefited from Ramsey's death and Len's conviction. He forwarded the message to his contact, a digital forensics expert named Riley, with a note. "Trace this number ASAP." Could be tied to Pierce or Ramsey's circle. He returned to the files, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. A yellowed report caught his attention, a witness statement from a neighbor who'd heard. Doddity, a muffled argument, and a strange metallic clank near Ramsey's penthouse. Around midnight, the statement had been dismissed as irrelevant during the original investigation, but Delgado's instincts screamed otherwise. He cross-referenced it with the phone logs. One of Pierce's calls, made at Shuar, San AM, had pinged a tower just blocks from the crime scene. The timing was too close to be coincidence. Delgado leaned back, rubbing his temples. The pieces were coming together, but the clock was ticking. The Sutsaba-hour stay would end tomorrow morning, and while Len's conviction had been vacated, the state could still file new charges if the evidence wasn't conclusive. He grabbed his phone and dialed Riley. "Any progress on those financial records?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Working on it," Riley replied, the sound of typing in the background. "Pierce's shell companies are a maze, but I've got a lead on a bank transfer to an offshore account the day after Ramsey's death. If we can tie it to one of Ramsey's business partners, it might prove they hired Pierce to set up Carter." "Do it fast," Delgado said. "We've got less than 24 hours." As he hung up, a knock on the door startled him. It was Officer Patel, a young cop who'd been quietly supporting Delgado's efforts. "Sir, you've got a visitor. Assistant D.A. Hargrove is here." Delgado's stomach twisted. Hargrove, the man who'd prosecuted Len, had been cooperative in court, But Delgado didn't fully trust him. "Send him in," he said, bracing himself. Hargrove entered, his suit slightly rumpled, his face drawn. "Delgado," he said, his voice low, "I've been doing some digging of my own. Found an old email from one of Ramsey's partners, a guy named Marcus Tate, to a city official. It's vague, but it hints at cleaning up loose ends before Ramsey's death. I think it's worth pursuing." Delgado raised an eyebrow, surprised by Hargrove's initiative. "Why the change of heart, Hargrove? You were ready to let Carter die yesterday." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about the suppressed report. I thought we had an airtight case. If I was played, I want to know who pulled the strings. And if Carter's innocent, I don't want his blood on my hands." Delgado studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Send me the email. I'll pass it to my contact. But if you're serious, you'll need to testify if this goes to a retrial. No hedging." Hargrove gave a curt nod. "I know. I'm in." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, Delgado, I'm sorry. I should have questioned things sooner." Delgado didn't respond, letting the door close behind Hargrove. Apologies wouldn't undo 5 years of Len's life, but they were a start. He turned back to the files, determined to find the final piece that would bury the conspiracy for good. Back at Clara's house, Len stood at the kitchen window, freeze, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Shadow lay at his feet, chewing on a toy Clara had bought him. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal, like a gift he didn't deserve. Clara joined him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him one. "Thanks," Len said, taking a sip. The warmth spread through him. A small comfort. "I keep waiting for someone to knock on the door and say it was all a mistake." Clara's eyes softened. "It's real, Len. You're here. And we're not letting anyone take you away again." She hesitated, then added. Delgado texted back. "He's tracing that number. Says it might be connected to one of Ramsey's old partners." Len's grip on the mug tightened. "So it's not over," he said quietly. "Not yet," Clara admitted, "but you've got people fighting for you now. Delgado, me, even Hargrove, and Shadow," she added with a small smile, nudging the dog with her foot. Shadow looked up, tail wagging, as if agreeing. Len knelt to ruffle Shadow's ears, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept me going, boy. Every day in that cell I thought about you and Clara. Kept me from giving up." Shadow licked his hand, a soft whine escaping his throat. Clara sat beside him on the floor, their shoulders touching. "We're going to rebuild, Len. It won't be easy, but we'll do it together. You, me, and this goofy dog." Len looked at her, his heart swelling with a love that had survived years of pain. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do anything," Clara replied, leaning her head against his. "Just be you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm glow, Len felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he wasn't facing it alone. Shadow's steady presence and Clara's unwavering love were his foundation. And no matter what shadows lingered from the past, he was ready to step into the light. The morning sun spilled over Redwood Creek's walking trail. "Aya." But, sun, its golden rays glinting off the water like a promise of new beginnings. "Beginnings?" Leonard Carter stood at the trailhead, Shadow's leash loose in his hand, the German shepherd trotting happily beside him. Clara Evans walked on his other side, her hair catching the breeze, a soft smile on her face. This was their spot, the place where they'd walked Shadow daily before Len's arrest, where dreams of a shared future had once felt unstoppable. Now, a month after Len's release, they were back, reclaiming a piece of the life stolen from them. Len wore a simple t-shirt and jeans. The feel of casual clothes, still a novelty. After years in a prison jumpsuit, he inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs with a freedom he was still learning to trust. Shadow let out a playful bark, pausing to sniff a patch of wildflowers, his tail wagging like a metronome. Len glanced at Clara, his heart swelling. "This feels right," he said softly. "Being here with you and Shadow, it's like I'm waking up from a nightmare." Clara squeezed his arm, her eyes bright with emotion. "It's real, Len. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. And we're not going anywhere." She laughed lightly as Shadow tugged at the leash, eager to explore. "Though this guy might have other plans," Len chuckled, the sound foreign but welcome. "He's still the same old Shadow, isn't he? Always chasing something." He knelt to ruffle the dog's fur, Shadow's ice-blue eyes meeting his, with that familiar, unspoken understanding. For years, the memory of those eyes had been Len's lifeline, a reason to keep fighting through the darkest nights on death row. As they walked along the gravel path, the creek murmuring beside them, a figure approached in the distance. It was Detective Anton Delgado, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, a far cry from his usual detective suit. He'd texted Len the night before, asking to join them on this walk, a gesture Len hadn't expected but welcomed. "Morning," Delgado called, raising a hand, a slight grin on his face. Len replied, nodding. The tension he'd once felt around Delgado, the man who'd built the case against him, had faded over the past month. They'd forged an uneasy but genuine understanding, bound by the truth they'd uncovered together. "Thanks for coming." Delgado crouched to pet Shadow, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. He said, then looked up at Len. "You hear the news? The final indictments came down yesterday. Those 3 businessmen, Walton Pierce, implicated, Marcus Tate, Edward Lang, and Philip Carver. They're all under arrest. The whole conspiracy's unraveling." Len exhaled, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lifting from his shoulders. "So it's really over?" he asked, his voice tinged with cautious hope. Delgado shrugged, standing. "There might be smaller players still out there, but the big fish are done. Redwood City's going to be dealing with the fallout for years. And I owe you an apology, Len, not just me, but the whole system. We failed you." Len met his gaze, his expression steady. "You can't change the past, Anton, but you're here now, and you fought for the truth. That's enough." He paused, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "If you want to make it up to me, keep digging into cases like mine. Don't let another person lose years to a lie." Delgado nodded solemnly. "Deal. I'm already working with a task force on wrongful convictions. Your case? It's changed a lot of us." Clara smiled faintly, letting Shadow off the leash for a moment. The German shepherd bounded through the grass, chasing a butterfly, his joy infectious. She turned to Len. "She keening. We got a letter from the State Compensation Board yesterday," she said. "They're offering a settlement for your wrongful imprisonment. It's not everything, but it's something." Len shrugged, watching Shadow romp. "Money won't give me back 5 years, but it'll help us start over. Maybe get a place with a big yard for this guy." He glanced at Clara, a spark of an idea forming. "Or maybe we could start a non-profit. Help others who've been wrongfully convicted. Give them a voice." Clara's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful idea, Len. I'm in. Whatever you want to do, we'll do it together." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Clara. You and Shadow. You were my reason to keep going." Every single day, her eyes glistened as she leaned closer. "You were always in my heart, Len, no matter how dark it got." She placed a hand on his cheek, her voice trembling. "We lost so much time. Let's not waste another second." Len pressed his forehead against hers, the warmth of her presence anchoring him. "No more wasted time," he whispered. Shadow returned, circling them with a happy bark, as if urging them to keep moving. They laughed, falling into step behind him. The creek's gentle current, a reminder that life, like the water, kept flowing forward. Delgado stepped back, giving them room to breathe. He observed the couple and their dog, a quiet contentment settling over him. The city around them was still navigating the aftermath. News of the arrests had ignited headlines and demands for change. Assistant DA Thomas Hargrove had issued a public apology, acknowledging his part in the imperfect prosecution, though he maintained he was unaware of the overlooked forensic report. His professional standing had suffered greatly, but he'd contributed vital evidence connecting Ramsey's associates to the scheme, a modest gesture of immense. Walton Pierce, the individual who'd orchestrated the crime scene, had buckled under scrutiny, admitting to setting up Lynn on the orders of Tate, Lang, and Carver. The trio had sought to remove Ramsey to safeguard their questionable real estate ventures, and Len, a junior employee with a minor disagreement with Ramsey, had been an easy target. Pierce's confession, paired with phone records, financial documents, and the previously ignored forensic report, had secured their accountability. For Len, the truth was a mixed blessing, and his name was cleared, but the years lost, birthdays, holidays, quiet evenings with Clara, could never be regained. Yet, as he strolled beside the creek, Shadow's leash in one hand and Clara's hand in the other, he felt a tranquility he hadn't known in years. The troubling dreams still lingered, echoes of the execution chamber, or the sound of cell doors closing, but they were gentler now, less frequent. Counseling, suggested by Clara, was proving helpful. Though Len preferred to work through things in his own way, with Shadow and Clara by his side, they paused at a curve in the trail where the creek widened, its surface reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. Shadow splashed at the water's edge, chasing a leaf, and Len laughed, the sound rich and heartfelt. Clara pulled out her phone, capturing a photo. "For the new moments," she said, her smile radiant. Len looked at her, then at Shadow, and felt a wave of gratitude. "I want this every day," he said, "walking here, with you two. Starting fresh, we will," Clara vowed, slipping her arm around his waist. "Maybe we'll even get Shadow a companion, a new dog, to keep him lively." Len grinned, the thought sparking happiness. He'd love that. "But let's go one step at a time, like you said." As they continued along the path, the horizon opened wide and bright, a canvas of opportunity. Redwood City would continue wrestling with its controversies, but here, in this moment, Len, Clara, and Shadow were creating a space for renewal. The orchestrators of the scheme were now held accountable. The truth was revealed, and Len was no longer confined, not by bars or by fear. Dallow Shadow bounded ahead, his silver and black fur shimmering in the sunlight, a living symbol of strength. Len tightened his hold on Clara's hand, their footprints side by side in the gravel. This was their fresh start, shaped by hardship, but defined by love. Shadow had been more than a companion. He'd been Len's hope, his reason to persevere, and through his steadfast loyalty, he'd guided Len back to freedom. In the gentle rustle of leaves and the steady murmur of the creek, Len discovered a belief in tomorrow he'd thought was gone forever. He wasn't merely a man who'd overcome injustice. He was a man with purpose, a family, and a future. With Clara's love and Shadow's unwavering spirit, he was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, one hopeful step at a time.